Hey y'all, it's Vanessa here. I wanted to go over the supplies that you'll need if you want to make any project, really, whether it's a mini quilt or a larger quilt, using foundation paper piecing techniques. It seems to me from the comments that I'm getting that a lot of you don't feel like you have the supplies necessary to give foundation paper piecing a try. So I just wanted to kind of point out some of the things that are necessary, and then I'll briefly cover some optional things as well. So foundation paper piecing requires you to have a printer or some way to print out the templates for the pattern that you'll be making. So a designer needs to create one of these. There's lots of free ones online. This is actually a free practice block that I created for y'all. So you can use the link in the description box below, and that will take you to my website so that you can download this little practice block, and then you too can print it out and give it a try, okay? Now, it's important to note that depending on the size of the foundation or the block itself, will depend on how many sheets you will need to print out, right? If this block is designed to finish 4 inches by 4 inches, then it's easy for me to say or to tell that in one 8.5 by 11 inch sheet of printer paper, I can position 2 of them like this. But this is not going to be the case for all the projects that you tackle, so just keep that in mind to make sure that you have enough paper to print out as many of the foundations that you'll need, because you will need one foundation per block. So for example, this had one foundation with this design on it. These have already been peeled off, but one per block. So I need to use one chunk of the paper to make one block and then the other. So that's the same thing that I'm going to do with these two. So basically from this sheet, I will be able to make 2 blocks just as shown here. All right, so we got the block, the foundation paper piecing block that we want to make. You've printed it out. Now it's important also to talk a little bit about the paper. This is going to depend on which technique you are going to be using. For the most basic, traditional kind of foundation paper piecing technique, oftentimes we use a thin, easy to rip paper because we will be stitching directly on these dark, solid black lines that are printed out on the foundation. However, there are other ways and other techniques of making them that require you to have special sheets of freezer paper that you can actually run through your printer. But I will cover that in my online quilt club. That's not something that I'm going to cover here. But I did want to share the foundation paper that I use. This is by Carol Doak. We do carry this in our online shop, and as you can see, it's going to be one of the most economical packs that you can find because it comes with 100 sheets. So you have plenty here to make as many FPP projects really as you'd like. You would just print out each template on the sheets, all right? So this is one of my favorite sheets to use when I am using the stitch through the paper technique of foundation paper piecing. And again, this is in our online shop, so I'll put the link in the description box below so that you know where you can purchase a pack like that as well. So we got the paper. Now, the reason I like that foundation paper is because it's easy to rip and tear. And if you're familiar with foundation paper piecing, you know that we often have to flip the project over and rip out the bits before we put it into an actual project. So for example, here's a little mini quilt that we'll be working on in my new online quilt club, which is all about foundation paper piecing. And each one of these was an individual block made and built up on an individual foundation. Just like I showed you, I printed out this design on the sheets of paper. I selected my fabrics. I went with kind of a monochromatic vibe for each one of them. I think this is going to look great on my mini quilt wall. And then I pieced them together like you would any other quilt, right? Then I basted it. I did a little spray baste on it onto batting and backing. Then I'll just go in to finish it off with quilting, trim it up, square it all up, and then bind it, right, to finish off my mini quilt. So we want to be able to rip the paper off, because imagine if I still had paper on the back of these blocks. That would not be any fun. It would be crinkling up. When you washed it, it would start to dissolve and you'd end up with clumps of paper all up in here behind the background pieces of the mini quilt, and we don't want that. So the paper does need to be torn away before you get to the completing steps of your mini quilts or any size quilt, really. All right, so recap. We got the foundation paper that I recommend. I don't recommend that you use regular printer paper unless you can get your hands on some super duper duper thin stuff, okay? Because what happens is when the paper is too thick and we go to peel off the paper backing, you need to tug on it more to rip the paper off, and oftentimes you will take stitches with you and it just throws off the tension of your seam lines and you can end up even breaking stitches. It's just a hot mess, all right? So go with the foundation paper. This is not what you want, that's regular printer paper. Then we have fabric. So for me here, you can see this is one of my favorite reasons to work on especially little cute mini quilts, because I get to use my fabric scraps. So as you can see, you probably recognize these fabrics from these two blocks. You don't need that much fabric. So if you are a quilter who collects a lot of like fat quarters, or you cut down yardage and end up with little chunks like this, these size pieces are gonna work fine, assuming that you're working with some smaller blocks. Now, for you to know what size fabric piece you need to use to position for each separate segment of the different parts of your blocks, either the designer, for whatever pattern you're using, likely will tell you what size to cut your pieces to, or you need to do the math yourself and figure it out. Luckily for you, if you're thinking about joining my new online quilt club, I do all the math for you, and that way you don't end up with blocks that are like this, where you do everything and then you end up missing a nice big chunk, which is more than the 1/4 inch. So, I mean, you could put another piece of fabric there. You can trim it further down. It's not going to be even with this one. And then if you had other blocks, you could sew it together and go really wide here, but I'd have to use at least a 1/2 of an inch or a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's just a mess, right? And it just doesn't feel as good to see a nice, perfectly squared and crisp looking block. This oftentimes happens to beginners and more experienced paper piecers alike, because I just didn't gauge the size of this corner background piece correctly. And so what I do when I teach foundation paper piecing is I give you the measurements that you need to cut for each of the individual sections of your quilt blocks with room to spare, so that when you do sew it on, press it back and give it a good press with your iron, you don't end up with this. Okay, so fabric scraps is what you'll need. When it comes to the thread, I always like to use a nice pale gray. I find that for someone like me who likes to make projects that feature lots of different colors, different shades of colors, oftentimes with light backgrounds, the gray just seems to go great with everything, whether it's on color. Okay, in the seams, I pieced all of these with the same gray thread. Even when it's sewn to white, you don't see the gray stitching. So I just find that it blends really good from light to medium colored fabrics. Now, if you're gonna be working with really dark prints or really dark solids, then you'd probably like to go, you probably would want to go with a darker thread. But I find like a light cream color or a pale gray works really, really well. So far we have the paper with the design printed on it. We have fabric scraps. We have thread. We need a sewing machine that can do a straight stitch, okay? And preferably one where you can adjust the length of the straight stitch. So for me, on this sewing machine, the stitch length setting is here at the 2.2. For different foundation paper piecing techniques, I will change this length, okay, according to the technique that I'm applying. So in order to work on, say, the newsprint foundation that we have here, that I talked about previously because it's easy to rip, on something like this, I will likely drop my stitch length down to about a 1.5. I've even done it with the 1.8 and it works okay for me. The longer the stitch, the easier it's going to be for you to pull the stitch and mess with it when you're ripping out the paper. So that's not necessarily what you want, right? We typically like to shorten the stitch length when we're stitching directly through the paper on the foundation through down into the fabric pieces, because the shorter the stitch length, the tighter, closer, and stronger that seam is going to be, and the closer it will perforate the paper, which when we get to the point where we're pulling out the paper bits, it just comes right out. Makes it super duper easy, okay? So if you have a sewing machine, either a mechanical one that you can like twist a knob and change the stitch length setting shorter, go